Hey there guys, Pastor Gary here, and boy, it's so good to be back with you and continuing down the road as we are on our Study 66, where of course we are going through the Bible and through 66 books. This is the added feature that we do that we have entitled Offroad, because it gives us a chance to do a little bit differently than just stick with the text that we look at each and every week. If you come out to the church, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't come out to the church, we are going through every book of the Bible. We are just kind of cruising through, giving you an idea of what they're about. And again, Offroad is our opportunity to kind of take a separate little look at something, and hopefully you find it edifying. So I hope you enjoy this. And of course, today we are in the book of Esther. And the only reason we're doing Esther right now is because I wanted to supplement this and do this for Mother's Day, which of course is this week coming up. And so let me just wish all the moms out there a happy Mother's Day. And so we're taking the book of Esther because there's a good, strong woman in the lead here. A lot of interesting things in the book of Esther, by the way. Intriguing, I would say. The book of Esther is not what it might seem on the surface that a book of the Bible would be. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, what I mean is, it's interesting. Who's the main character of the Bible? Of course, it's God, right? We speak of God. We start with God in the very beginning. God creates. And then we go all the way through the Bible. And at the very end of the book of Revelation, it tells us there that God He will be their God. They will be His people. God, God, God. But it's interesting when you get to the book of Esther. Why is that? Because we don't see God. We don't see God. The name of God does not appear in the book of Esther. So what could that mean? Well, I want you to picture in your mind, you're a detective. You get called on a case. You go to the place where it's happening. Let's say it's a high rise in New York, and maybe it's a CSI episode. And you go in and you look. Now, when you walk in and look, you're not going to see necessarily the perpetrator. Who's behind the activity, are you? But what will you eventually find? Well, what you're searching for are clues. You're searching for those things like fingerprints and so forth. Why? Because they will show you who has been there, what work has been done by whom. Well, the book of Esther has God's fingerprints all over it. And so as we look at that, I want you to keep in mind that the book of Esther will express the providence of God, that He's in control of everything. He is over all things. It's going to demonstrate to you how God moves people, how God is working behind the scenes. You see, you don't have to necessarily see God in everything to understand that He's at work. That's important for you and I to understand in those times where God may seem distant from us, where we may not see all the evidence of God in our life, but you can be sure He's still working, and you will eventually find those fingerprints all over again. So let's look at the main idea of this great book. We see God working behind the scenes, as I formally said. And who is He working with? Well, He's working through Queen Esther. Now, Esther's Hebrew name is Hadassah. And Hadassah, would not have been, it may have been dangerous for her to be known as a Jewish person. And so another Jewish person, Mordecai, we'll talk about him in a moment. Mordecai says to Hadassah, you need to change your name to Esther. So she changes her name to Esther, is what she does. And Mordecai and Esther will be used to do what? To save the Jewish people from extermination. Well, the kingdom that they're in is the Persian kingdom. Xerxes is the king, even though he is alluded to as Ahasuerus. And Ahasuerus would have been Xerxes or Ahasuerus, from what we know about him. There's some discrepancy to be used there. So if you hear differently, that's probably what it is. And so as we explain this, we'll talk a little bit about what's going on here. Let's include now another name. So we have Xerxes the king, the Persian king. We have Esther, the young girl that's being brought into that kingdom. And then you have Mordecai, who is her cousin or her guardian. He adopts her is what he does. There's some manuscripts actually that say that he married her. Now you can't think of it as like, ooh, he married her. Oftentimes the men would marry a woman so that other men would leave her alone. They would honor that idea of being married. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I think it's just interesting. The other woman I want to bring up is the queen now. Xerxes' queen is Vashti. Now, Vashti is an interesting woman, and we'll talk about her a little bit also. So let's explain a little bit more in Esther chapter 1. We have a great feast that's going on. You know, there was a lot of feasting. This guy, Xerxes, definitely was a guy who liked to get his party on, to say the least. And so he's throwing a giant feast for all the men of Susa. That's where they are seated. That's where the capital is, in this place called Susa in the ancient empire, the Persian Empire. And this is where he reigns and rules, meaning Xerxes, over the ancient world. Basically, he rules and reigns from India to Ethiopia into Asia Minor is where he is. This feast is to last 180 days. Can you imagine? Oh my goodness, is what it's supposed to last. Vashti is holding a banquet of her own. We don't have any reason to believe for all 180 days, but Vashti holds one for the wives of the region is what she's doing. So she's involved in that particular pursuit also for those women. So on the 7th day of this feast, Xerxes, now who is drunk, and we see often this drinking. By the way, there's a lot of, I guess the word is ambiguity about moral situations when we get into the book of Esther. There's a lot of drinking. There's a lot of eating of food that the Jewish people shouldn't eat, considered in the Torah and so forth. And so you see a lot of things like this going on. But what I want you to remember is God still works behind the scenes is what he does. So we have our king who is drunk, and he says to his queen, he has sent to the queen saying, hey, I want you in my presence of all these people, I want you to put on your crown and get down here because I'm going to show you off is what I'm going to do. You come and stand before the people so that everyone sees your beauty. Esther chapter 1, verses 10 and 11. The queen, Vashti, for her own reasons, and if we have time here in a second, we'll get to it, some of the reasons that it's thought that maybe she did this, she refuses. Now, listen, you do not deny the king what he wants. That's not what you do. And so anyway, she defies him in front of all these people. So the royal wise men who surround the king, they're upset for the king. They're telling the king, hey, listen, this isn't making you look good. And this especially does not make any of us look good in front of our wives. You know, we've got them under our thumbs. We tell them what to do and how high to jump. And now she's defied you, and all the other women in the kingdom now will defy us. And they were really, really upset with that. If Vashti can get away with disrespecting her husband, so can I. That's what they're afraid the other women will be thinking. By the way, verses 16 and 18 there in chapter 1. So how does Xerxes, he's kind of a weak fella, at least by now. He's a little older, and he's a great warrior at one time, but now he's a little weak and so forth. So he responds, he sends out an edict saying that Vashti will never be allowed to come before him again. And the king is going to give the crown to another woman. Well, that in effect means Vashti's done. Now, some people believe that she would have been executed at that point. Others believe other scenarios there, just so you know. So maybe she was just banished. Who knows? But anyway, so this begins this issue or this situation where after Vashti is banished, that they now search out the new queen is what they want to get. And so we have the guys around Xerxes saying, now you need a new queen, and let's trade up for a better version of a queen and so forth and so on. And that's what they start to do. And so what do? They go out through the kingdom, all throughout the kingdom. Again, it's huge, and they're finding as many beautiful virgins as they can find, chosen all around. And from among them, we get, of course, Hadassah, or Esther is who we have that comes on the scene, this Jewish girl. And so this is giving us, basically, we're seeing how God's providence is moving already. All the things are being moved around. Vashti is being removed so that Esther can be moved in. And God is behind this because there is coming a day she needs to be in this place to take care of the situation that was going to happen. So she eventually gets into Vashti's place, and the right person at the right time, as it's so often said. And this is an important position that places her right where she needs to be, so that the people of God will not be annihilated. So, and the Haggadah, which of course is a book of Jewish tradition and folklore, those types of things. This is what it says of Vashti and what goes on there. She was the daughter of the Babylonian king Belshazzar. So you know that, when the Persians came in and took over from the Babylonians, so they take over. They say that she was the daughter of the king at the time, and that she would have been given to Xerxes as his wife. And so on the night that he was killed. And so, that's one of the thoughts that's given to us from the Haggadah. There's other legends out there. The legends are Vashti's refusal to appear was because of her modesty. Coming from a different culture, her modesty, she was not going to go down in front of all those men naked. That's often what's cited. That's what many people believe it was all about. The king said, hey, put on your crown, but nothing else, and get down here. So there are people that believe that. Another thought was she figured she would be mobbed by the drunken crowd and the king would be killed, so supposedly to protect the king. On the other side, though, she had such loathing for her husband, whom she considered to have non-royal blood, that she wasn't going, there was no way she was going to get mobbed or anything like that. So she could care less what happened to him. And then there was another one actually said she may have had leprosy and she didn't want to show people that she had the leprosy. Whatever the reason was, we know that God moved and we know that God did what he did. So was she killed? It could be. Was she just banished? It could also be. But that gives you a little bit about her. Then we have Mordecai, who is like a father to Esther. And so Mordecai overhears a plot. Once he overhears the plot, it's to assassinate the king. He gets into Esther's ear and says, hey, there's a plot to kill the king, is what he says. And so he reports it to Esther. So she gets it through to the king, and the king hears it. And of course, it's dealt with. And this is good. So it's recorded in what is known as the historical record of the king, is what it's known as. And so that'll come back later. And you can find that in Esther chapter 2 and verse 23. Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, now promotes another man named Haman, or probably more properly pronounced as Haman. And Haman is an Agagite. He's a Canaanite, an Agagite, to the highest position on his royal staff is what he does. And he commands everyone to bow down to him and pay him homage. Now let's look at the Agagite here for a minute, known as Haman. So we see him in Esther chapter 3, 5 and 6. He's an enemy of Mordecai and the Jewish people. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel or bow down to him, he was enraged. So what you had here was Haman wanted everybody. Mordecai is kind of known. He's at the gates all the time. He's checking up on Esther. And he notices that this Jewish person is not bowing down to him. And he hates it. He despises it. He's anti-Semitic. And so he learns about all of this. He sees what's going on with Mordecai. And so what Haman wants is, Haman's goal now is to get rid of Mordecai and get rid of Mordecai's people, is what he wants to do. And this is what really the book of Esther is coming down to, is what it is. This Agagite is the son of a man who was likely the descendant of King Agag. And that's where the idea of an Agagite comes from, which of course were enemies of the Jewish people from way back when? Centuries earlier. And you can find that out in 1 Samuel chapter 15. And so you see all these things that are going on coming into place, and all the scene is being set up for what? For everything to happen, that the Jewish people now are at the crux of existence or annihilation, is what's going on. Mordecai refuses to bow, is what he does. He refuses to honor Haman. This will absolutely enrage Haman. And so his plan, again, is to eradicate not just Mordecai, but all the Jewish people, unfortunately, is what he wants to do. So this edict is sent out because Mordecai, or Haman, basically fools the king into buying his story. And it's sent out that these people should be destroyed. So Haman, being the guy that he is, basically tells the king, this is what we want to happen. And the king goes along with it. And now the scene is set for what's going on. Mordecai gets to his cousin and says, Esther, you need to go before the king and you need to tell him what's going on is what you need to do. You need to plead with him personally for the people is what you need to do. She knows, they all know, that going before the king without being called before the king will displease the king. Now, when you displease the king, it's not like he just says, throw her in jail for 2 or 3 days, let her think about it, or let's give her a fine. No. You will die if you go before the king and risk your life, because this law applies to anyone and everyone, it says in Esther chapter 4. Mordecai stays on her, though, and really, really wants her and says to her, hey, listen, if you keep silent, your people are going to die. You're going to die, and your people are going to die. And who knows? And this is the famous line, maybe God put you in this position for such a time as this. And of course, that's the famous idea of what that's all about. And so they go back, they fast, they pray, they do all these other things. They come up with the plan where Esther is going to come before the king. They're going to throw a banquet. And we know how that sort of works. We'll get more into that on Sunday. But this sets up now because there's an interesting little thing that happens here. So the king has a sleepless night, commands the historical records to be open, if you remember the story. And so providentially, he happens to be turned to this portion of the historical records. These are all the events. Sometimes when the king would get depressed, he wants to hear of all of his conquers and all the things that he's done great in life. And, he wants to get a pat on the back and be lifted. Oh, you're just a great king. And they just happened to open up to where Mordecai, remember, discovered that assassination plot. And he had it reported to the king, which saved the king's life, is what happened. The king then realized nothing has been done to reward this man named Mordecai. So he asks Haman, he says, what should be done for the man the king wants to honor? Esther chapter 6 and verse 6. Now, Haman thinks this is coming towards him. Haman thinks, oh, the king wants to honor me. This is the devious plot of what pride and ego will do to you. It will destroy you. So he thinks that's going to happen. And so Haman answers the question, and about the wearing the finest clothes, riding on the king's horse, being honored throughout the city and so forth. Well, what happens is, of course, the king is not talking. Xerxes was not talking about Haman. He was talking about Mordecai. You talk about enraging Haman. This is what happens. He kind of stokes that fire a little bit because he's got to walk Mordecai around the city, leading him on that horse. How utterly humiliating for this man who wants to destroy that other man. His pride getting to him. So they eventually discover the plot, and we'll get into all that on Sunday. But I want you to know, on the trajectory of things, what you have now is you have Mordecai coming up, but now Haman is coming down. And that's what happens when you mess with the Jewish people. You bless those who bless and curse those who curse. That's what happens when you mess with God's plan. Understand, God is working behind the scene. This is what he does. That's one of the first themes you see in this book. God works behind the scenes. The second scene you see here is what we often say to one another, we often quote to one another, is that really all things do work together for good to those who love the Lord. And this is what you see happening here with Esther. This is what you see happening here with Mordecai, with the Jewish people. It's beautiful what goes on there. We see from way back, the Jewish people, God's chosen people, have been persecuted throughout history, throughout time. And it continues through to this day. And the last and final one, promotion. You and I have to learn that we need to allow God to promote us. That's what we need to do. We don't try to promote ourselves. Haman was a power-hungry guy, willing to do anything, destroy anyone to get to his position. Mordecai was a humble man. Mordecai served and did the right thing, was rewarded for it. And Esther totally relied on the Lord in her life to be brought before the king, exalted before the king, and allow this plan to save the Jewish people to unfold. It's a wildly fascinating, wonderful story. And I hope that if you can come out Sunday, we'll see how all this fits together and what this means to you. Be blessed today as we've gone through the book of Esther.